Hi, everyone. How are you doing today? Thank you so much for making time to join us for this really almost historic meeting. We have been, so my name is Roden Monrose. I'm the CEO and founder of CariClub. So thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about this meeting because since starting this company, one of the feedback that we always received from nonprofits is that they have a desire to provide the best possible experience for nonprofits. For the young professionals that eventually join their associate boards. But there's not a lot of knowledge out there, knowledge sharing around how to really assemble the best possible associate board and do that effectively. And so we worked with the incredible team at NYU Wagner, who you will get to meet in a few minutes. And they spent a great deal of time, energy, effort, and diligence into being that conduit. They were able to speak with hundreds of nonprofits and get their feedback around what are the best practices for forming associate boards. And I can't wait to share that with you today. And so for those of you that don't know CariClub, CariClub is a tech-enabled platform. We make it easy for corporations to develop and retain their next generation of world-class leaders and culture carriers. We work with some incredible companies like Citigroup, Deloitte, Davis Polk, Morgan Stanley, and KKR to place their high-potential employees on nonprofit boards. These high-performing companies partner with CariClub in order to place their best employees on these leading nonprofit organizations. CariClub's board matching technology removes all of the friction that makes it very difficult for companies to establish a board matching program themselves. Launched a company in 2015, and since then, we've partnered with hundreds of nonprofits and foundations to place their young professionals on boards at no cost to the nonprofit organizations. We're based in New York City, and CariClub is really reimagining what it means for companies to do well and do good. So without further ado, I want to really get you introduced to the main event of this meeting, the NYU team. So please welcome the NYU Capstone Team, Rachel Schultz, Gabrielle Gallo, Luke Jones, Emma Ruben. NYU Wagner engages teams of public affairs students to address complex challenges, identify new opportunities, and provide recommendations for client organizations. Over the past year, the Capstone team has worked with CariClub to produce a deep dive research into how an associate board impacts a nonprofit organization, Demystifying Nonprofit Associate Boards. Today, Rachel, Luke, and Gabrielle will share their findings with us. Without further ado, I will like the team to take it away. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to learn everything you have to offer today.
Great, thank you so much, Roden. So we'll just have Luke share his screen so we can start the presentation.
You seeing it?
Yes, that's great. Thank you, Luke.
Great.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy during this time. We are really excited to be here today to share with you the high-level summary of our findings from our research done this year on associate boards. And due to these unusual circumstances and of course presenting over Zoom, we're just asking that throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please type those into the chat function, and we will happily take those questions at the end of the presentation. And additionally, we will be sharing this recording as well as the presentation slides, so don't feel like you need to quickly write down information. You'll be able to look and digest this information on your own time as well. And we wanted to take this time to say thank you to CariClub for giving us this opportunity to present, and really for being such a wonderful partner in our research this year. Additionally, a special thank you to the nonprofits who actually may be here today that participated in our digital surveys and our interviews. We are beyond grateful for your participation, and we're really excited to be presenting today. So to give you all a brief overview of our presentation today, first, Luke is going to go through the literature review. Next, Gabrielle will discuss the digital surveys. I will then discuss the interviews, and lastly, Luke will go through recommendations. So now I'm going to hand it off to Luke to share a brief overview of our research methods and the literature review.
Thanks, Rachel. This is going to be repeat information for a lot of you, so apologies for that. But just to set some context, associate boards, also commonly referred to as young professional boards or junior boards, are really meant to leverage the energy and often the relevant skill set of young private sector professionals to support a nonprofit organization that's well matched to their interests and their passions. But because these boards are still kind of a nascent idea, not much data exists. So our intention was to collect initial feedback from the field regarding nonprofit experiences and reflections on engaging associate boards. And so our data collection was performed starting with a literature review to make sure that we're not creating redundancies with existing information. And then we used that literature review to inform an online survey and then a smaller number of in-person or over-the-phone interviews with individual nonprofit employees. So to give you a little information on the literature review, as you might expect, we received a low yield from academic resources. Most of the relevant information came from popular articles like op-eds or blog posts from nonprofit leadership who generally work closely with their associate board. Some important reflections did come out of that, mostly indicating the most significant perceived contributions of those organizations' associate boards, like diversifying their leadership, bringing a different generational perspective, and really sort of bringing a new energy to revitalize anything that might have felt stagnant. It also indicated some of the factors that leadership felt like led to effective associate board output, and some of the main ones that we highlighted are to provide a varied set of responsibilities, and particularly some high-level deliverables in decision-making. Along the line with that, interaction with the governing board or executive leadership can really add a sense of gravitas, and a sense that these young professionals' time and effort are being respected and taken seriously. And in a similar vein, also associate boards members who are viewed as long-term investments were more often to stay on long-term and to potentially become members of the governing board or to engage leadership in other significant ways. And part of that is providing some flexibility in scheduling and in methods of participation as lifestyle changes are generally more common for that age group. So now Gabrielle is going to take us through some of the results of the survey.
Great, thanks, Luke. So we approached our survey with the goal of better understanding the demographic makeup of nonprofits both with and without an associate board. And to that end, we broke it into 4 segments, obviously organizations with an associate board, organizations without. And we also looked at organizations who had had an associate board in the past but no longer did, and organizations that were in the process of establishing a board. For our respondents, we solicited responses from nonprofit contracts through CariClub and then through our own NYU Wagner network. And we had a response rate of about 25%. So overall, 44% of our respondents do have an associate board. Those with an associate board are more likely to have a larger staff. And for those without a board, they were more likely to be a smaller organization with less than 30 employees. They were also slightly more likely to have a budget under $3 million. So now we're going to take a deep look at organizations with an associate board. So we first wanted to better understand the intended functions of associate boards. A third of our respondents reported fundraising as a function, making it the most commonly reported, although event planning wasn't far behind, with 29% of associate boards involved in event planning, and that could be galas, volunteer events, and so on. Now, while this was a focus in the literature review, only 13% of our survey respondents turned to their associate boards for pro bono skills-based volunteering, such as digital marketing. However, in a post-COVID world, a recent CariClub survey found 69% of nonprofits are in fact seeking skilled-based volunteers. And then other functions from our survey included program ideation and strategy. We then wanted to get a feel for the financial expectations of associate board members, and a large majority of our survey respondents do require a give-get from their members. 59% require a give-get less than $1,000, but 18% do ask that their associate board members bring in over $2,000 to the organization. We also inquired as to the tenure of the organization's associate board members, and the tenure was distributed between 1 and 5 years, but we found not surprisingly, that it often depends on how long the associate board has been active. And to that end, the majority of the organizations we surveyed have relatively new boards, with 42% reporting that their associate boards have only been active for less than 2 years, and only a quarter reported boards that have been active for more than 5. And then in regards to the size of boards, it varied across organizations, but we did find some clusters. Roughly a third have 5 to 10 members, a third have more than 20 members, and a third have 11 to 15 members. As the relationship between associate boards and governing boards was a running theme throughout the literature, we wanted to get a better understanding of how that looked in practice. And we found that only 29% of organizations reported associate board members participating in governing board activities, and only 8% of organizations gave their associate board members voting rights. Relatedly, we inquired as to how many associate board members had moved to the governing board within organizations. 32% reported that 1 to 5 had moved on to the governing board. However, half of respondents reported that none of their associate board members had moved to the governing board. Mentoring was another theme that was mentioned in the literature review. We found that only 26% of our respondents provide a formal mentoring program for their associate board members. For those with a mentoring program, how those programs were structured, it did vary among the organizations. For example, one offered leadership development program, and then another reported that their governing board played an active role in both the recruitment and the onboarding of associate board members. So to better understand how engaged associate board members are, we looked at meeting cadence and attendance. And somewhat surprisingly, we found that the more frequently boards meet, the more likely the organization is to report a high attendance percentage. Of the organizations that hold monthly meetings, 57% reported full or close to full attendance. And the only organizations to report attendance not above 25% were those that met semi-annually. And then lastly, we inquired as to how successful organizations found their associate boards. A large majority, 77%, found their boards to be fairly successful. 14% declared them to not be successful at all, and only 9% reported that their boards were very successful. We cross-analyzed the demographics within those success categories to see if we could tease out any trends. We did find that of the organizations that find their associate boards to be very successful, they tend to be larger organizations, both in terms of budget and staff. But we weren't able to pull out any trends from the other two categories. Now we're going to take a deep dive into organizations without associate boards. And of the organizations without associate boards, the majority have never had a board, nor are they in the process of establishing one. 23% used to have a board but no longer do, and 16% were in the process of putting a board together. So obviously we wanted to get a better understanding of why organizations don't have an associate board. Of those without a board, the most stated reason for why that were limits on staff capacity. Many also stated that they simply didn't know how to begin to establish an associate board or even what an associate board is. For organizations who had previously had an associate board but no longer do, 40% stated that the reason for the dissolution was a lack of engagement. Staff capacity and retention issues were also offered as reasons for the board dissolving with equal frequency. And all three of these causes can potentially be addressed through the implementation of best practices, which Luke will talk about a little bit more when we get to the recommendation section. Again, we wanted to get an idea of the functions of the associate board, or in this case, the expected functions of boards that were in the process of being established. And unsurprisingly, it mirrors those that are already established, with fundraising and event planning frequently mentioned. Similar to what we found in the literature review, however, many organizations stated a need to diversify their leadership, and a desire to invest in future leadership was also given as a reason for establishing an associate board, which again was a thread we found in the literature review. I'm now going to pass it to Rachel, who's going to talk about our interview process a little bit.
Great, thank you so much, Gabrielle. So after the digital surveys, we wanted to dive a little deeper and gather more qualitative information that would really complement those digital surveys we had conducted. We first started with the interview script, and in creating the interview script, we kept these 4 main research questions and goals in mind that you see at the top here. And really the goal of these main questions was to uncover any latent information that may not have been discovered within those digital surveys. The audience, similar to our digital surveys, were organizations with associate boards, organizations without associate boards, and organizations that were in the process of establishing an associate board. And lastly, we solicited responses from nonprofit contacts provided by CariClub, as well as our digital survey respondents who indicated they would be willing to be interviewed, and the Wagner Network and our own professional networks. So now Gabrielle is going to briefly review the demographics of our participants.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So our organizations, or rather our interview participants came from organizations that varied across sectors, from health to education to arts and culture. All but 2 of our interview participants do have an associate board. The majority have more than 30 staff members. And the size of the associate board varied greatly. The smallest was just 3 members and the largest went all the way up to 90. However, interviewee respondents with larger boards often said that they felt the large boards were unwieldy, that they tended to have low engagement, and that they tended to hinder the overall success of the associate board. Again, we looked into the function of the associate boards, and very similar to our survey respondents, fundraising and event planning were the most common. There were no real surprises here. In regards to the actual board structure details, all but 2 of the organizations that we spoke with do have a give-get requirement, and those 2 that don't are in the process of establishing one. The requirements range broadly from $100 all the way up to $10,000, with an average of about $1,450. Many organizations also reported having a tiered system for their give-get requirements, usually based on the membership position of the member and their level of participation. Now, 42% of associate boards do interact with governing boards, which we found was higher than our survey respondents. However, none have voting rights. And while many organizations didn't have a formal process in place, they did occasionally host mixers or networking events for the associate board and governing board members to get to know one another. And several noted that associate board members would like more interaction with the governing board. And again, we wanted to get a feel for how engaged associate board members were, so we looked at meeting cadence and attendance. Meeting cadence ranged from monthly to semi-annually, with 42% meeting monthly, and the second most frequently reported cadence being quarterly. 47% reported a high meeting attendance, and only 11% reported low. And often those reporting high attendance also gave their members the option to call in rather than having to attend the meeting in person. And a number of organizations reported that in addition to their regular associate board meetings, members were also assigned or volunteered to committees or subcommittees that met either regularly or as needed on an ad hoc basis. And now I'm going to pass it back to Rachel, who's going to go through the analysis.
Great, thank you again, Gabrielle. So after conducting and documenting all of these 21 interviews, we then executed a thematic analysis. So while familiarizing ourselves with the data and really with each in-depth response, we found these 7 main themes within those responses on the left. Then within those 7 themes, we discovered patterns. We defined and edited those patterns to these 4 most frequent trends on the right. So you'll see those: purpose of an associate board, structure of an associate board, success of an associate board, and tools. So now we're going to actually dive a little deeper into each of these main trends. So in terms of purpose of an associate board, findings here, of no surprise, mirrored what Gabrielle mentioned in the findings of our digital survey, that the majority utilized their associate boards for fundraising and event planning. One important innovative approach worth mentioning was a nonprofit that utilized their associate board to connect existing programs to social impact initiatives. They were most recently linking gender equality to existing programs. And this approach of viewing young professional board members as thought leaders in subject matters of social impact really benefited the nonprofit internally and externally, as well as really developed that relationship between the members, the associate board members, and the nonprofit. And next, we're going to talk through structure and success. So we put these 2 trends together actually because they were consistently relating to one another. Nonprofits with high-performing associate boards had clear structures and clear communication around tasks and expectations, whereas nonprofits who had more disengaged associate boards tended to have less structure surrounding assigning tasks and managing their members. Other structures of nonprofits that led to more successful boards were things like when associate board members had access to governing board members, when the nonprofit really balanced priorities of fundraising and money with volunteering hours, and finally, when the nonprofit viewed the young professional board as an investment. One innovative approach that a few nonprofits utilized was conducting intentional networking events between their associate boards and their governing boards. One nonprofit actually went so far as requiring each associate board member to attend at least one governing board meeting per year. So this was a really interesting way to structure their associate board, and it produced a more successful and engaged board. And lastly here, we're going to talk through tools. The tools utilized by the majority of nonprofits to track performance and success of their associate board consisted mostly of tracking attendance, tracking donations, or tracking the success of an event, usually through tickets sold. Two really innovative approaches, though, to mention were firstly utilizing surveys. So the nonprofit sent surveys to their associate board members to hear directly from them on how the nonprofit can improve and how the associate board member feels they've impacted the organization. Lastly, utilizing the tool of scorecards. So here the nonprofit would send each member their scorecard mid-year to let them know where they stood with their goals, and then publicly recognize members that in the end had met those goals to really reinforce a sense of accountability. So now I'm going to pass it to Luke, who's going to go through our recommendations.
Yeah, thanks again, Rachel. So yeah, we thought it might be helpful to provide a few suggestions for anybody interested in developing their associate board that we felt like really shone through in all three tiers of our research. The first is in sourcing and onboarding. Anecdotally, people found that applicants who really expressed alignment with the mission and vision of the organization were the most effective associate board members. And encouraging volunteering with programs, not just with the board itself, is a good way to build that alignment. One thing that was mentioned was where possible to offer some training, ideally at onboarding, potentially to prime incoming board members for their leadership position. Offering networking events, particularly with governing board members, as we've mentioned, and potentially even hosting members of other associate boards for knowledge or experience sharing with your board are the kinds of things that your associate board members really benefit from and appreciate. And providing defining roles and board structure, or something like an org chart, giving individual roles or charges to members is helpful for accountability and for clarity for board members. And thankfully, CariClub happens to have just developed a tool for exactly that. The link is nice and easy to remember. It's just associateboards.com. I think that'll be really helpful. And so you can make things simpler and create efficiencies by maintaining one designated point of contact on both the board side and the organization side. And obviously, you don't need to discourage contact beyond that, but having one designated person who's responsible on each end for maintaining lines of communication. Allowing associate boards some participation in meaningful high-level decision-making, even if not with formal voting rights, helps them feel valued and like they have some real equity in the organization. And like we've mentioned, more frequent meeting times led to higher participation. And viewing members as long-term investments usually led to long-term payoff in the form of qualified, capable future leadership. And lastly, keeping track of whatever metrics of success you think are most important. It could be the give-get, events attended, volunteers sourced for your events. Keeping track of those accurately and actively, and then celebrating accomplishments with your board are a really good way to maintain momentum and keep people engaged. All right, thank you very much. We will now take your questions from chat, and we're happy to field any others that you might have.